They buried her name in the archives. The Alpha King wrote it back beside his own. She found it on a Thursday. That detail matters somehow, not a significant day. Not a feast day or a moontide or the anniversary of anything she could name. A Thursday in the archive room on the eastern wing of the Ironhold Palace, where the light came in sideways and yellow through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in a decade, and where the dust lay thick enough that her footprints followed her across the floor like a second set of witnesses. She found it on a Thursday, and her whole life split in two: before, after. The bonding records for the reign of Ragnar Ironhold, High King of the Northern Pax, spanned 11 volumes bound in black leather with iron clasps. 11 volumes covering 43 years, each entry inked in the careful hand of whatever palace scribe had held the post that decade. Each entry naming the bonded pairs, the date of recognition, the pack affiliation, the presiding elder. Isolde had catalogued them herself. She knew their weight, their smell, old vellum and iron gall ink, and something faintly mineral she had never been able to identify, like river stone after rain. She knew which clasps stuck and which swung free. She knew that Volume 7 had a water stain on the lower right corner of page 40 that looked, if you tilted it, exactly like a running fox. She had not, until that Thursday, looked at the entry for the 12th year of Ragnar's reign. She had not looked because the 12th year was 7 years ago, and 7 years ago she had been 19 years old, and living in the village of Ashmore, 3 days' ride from the capital, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a woman who made candles and smelled of beeswax every hour of every day. She had no business in the 12th year of Ragnar's reign. Nothing she knew of herself touched it. Except there was a gap. She stood in the yellow light, and she looked at the gap, and she felt the floor do something strange and subtle under her feet, as though it had shifted a quarter inch to the left without visibly moving. The entry for the 12th year read, "In the matter of the bonding recognition made in the 4th moon of the 12th year, the king having come before the elder council and declared the bond sensed, the name of the recognized." And then nothing, not a blank, not an omission, a scratch, deep and deliberate, the kind made with something harder than a quill, a knife's edge, maybe, or a pin pressed with intent. 3 lines of text scratched entirely away, the vellum roughed to near translucence, and then the record resumed below as though nothing had happened. As though the king's recognized bondmate had simply ceased to exist between one line and the next. Isolde's left hand, the one with the crooked 4th finger she'd broken falling from a pear tree at age 11, and which had never healed quite straight, pressed flat against the page. She stood there for a long time. The archive room was cold. October had come early this year, and the heating stones the steward allocated to the scribe's wing were not replaced until they cooled completely, and the one nearest her workbench had gone dark 2 hours ago. She had not noticed until now. She noticed now because her hand was cold against the page, and the cold felt like something was trying to reach her, and she couldn't tell if she was imagining that. She was probably imagining that. She closed Volume 7, set it back on its shelf, returned to her workbench and sat down and looked at the copy she'd been making of a trade agreement from the eastern borders. And she wrote exactly 4 words before she set the quill down and stared at the wall. The wall had nothing to tell her. She went back to the shelf, took Volume 7 down again, turned to the 12th year. The gap was still there. Here is what you need to know about Isolde, and it will take less time than you think. She was 26 years old. She had held the position of junior palace archivist for 3 years, having won the appointment through an examination that's placed her first among 47 candidates. A fact that the senior archivist, a man named Vorn with a jaw that jutted slightly to the left, like he was perpetually preparing to argue, had never quite forgiven her for. She was not beautiful in the way that stopped people in corridors. She was the other kind of beautiful, the kind you noticed a week later, in retrospect, with a sensation like having missed something important. Her hair was dark, and she kept it braided away from her face while she worked, and the only thing about her that was genuinely striking was her eyes. Not their color, which was ordinary brown, but the fact that when she was reading or thinking hard, her left eye drifted very slightly outward, just a degree, just enough that people sometimes turned to see what she was looking at when she wasn't looking at anything at all. She was precise. Disciplined. She had built her life around the reliable comfort of recorded truth, the idea that history, once written down correctly, stayed written down, that the archive was the place where things could not be altered or forgotten or denied, where the past remained exactly itself. She understood, standing in the cold with Volume 7 open in her hands, that she had been wrong about that. She had been wrong about other things, too. There were gaps in her own memory that she had always attributed to an unremarkable childhood. Nothing specific missing, just the ordinary blurring of years that blur. She did not remember her 19th year clearly. She had always assumed this was normal. She had never met another 19-year-old so afflicted, but she had never asked, either. It had not seemed like the kind of thing one asked about, she remembered. Leaving Ashmore. The journey north. Arriving at the capital for the scribe's examination 2 years later, at 21. Those 2 years between. There was something there, like a room she knew existed but couldn't find the door to. When she pushed at the memory, she got impressions. Impressions only. Cold. The smell of iron and pine. Something that might have been her own heartbeat, rapid and terrified, and also so underneath, charged with something else. Something she had no name for. She had always assumed the examination had been the first significant thing that happened to her. She was beginning to revise that assumption. Vaughan was already at his desk when she arrived the next morning. He was always already at his desk. It was one of his tactics, the implication that he had been there for hours before anyone else arrived, that he existed in a state of perpetual, superior industry. His desk was twice the size of hers. He had a heating stone that had been replaced so recently, it still radiated warmth from across the room. "Vaughan," she said. He looked up. He had a way of looking up that made it feel like looking down. Isolde. The bonding records for the 12th year of the king's reign. She kept her voice level. She was good at level. She had practiced level for years. There's an entry that's been damaged, scratched out. Records deteriorate. He returned to his work. It's the nature of the medium. This was deliberate, a pause, shorter than it should have been. Records deteriorate, he said again. Same words, same tone. Too same. The vellum is roughed through. Something with an edge did it, not age. Then it was damaged before it came to us. He turned a page, note it in the catalog log and move on. We document what exists, Isolde. We don't reconstruct what doesn't. She stood there for a moment longer than was comfortable, long enough to make it a choice. "Of course," she said. She went to her desk. She did not note it in the catalog log. The Palace of Ironhold had been built in 3 phases across 2 centuries, and only someone who lived inside it daily would know how to move through it efficiently, which corridors connected, which staircases doubled back on themselves, which wings were locked at sundown, and which could be entered through the servants' passage that ran behind the great hall. Isolde had spent 3 years mapping it the way she mapped everything, methodically, quietly, in her own time. She knew where the elder records were kept. She went on a Friday, an hour after Compline, when the night wardens had just changed, and the hall outside the records room was briefly and reliably empty, for 4 minutes, as the previous shift returned their lanterns and the new one collected theirs. 4 minutes was enough. She had planned for 3. The elder records were older than the archive. They smelled different, not the mineral, stone water smell of the bonding volumes, but something thicker, Closer to incense, cedar and dried wormwood, and underneath both of those the faint animal musk of very old pack scent. They were wrapped in cloth that had once been red and had faded to the color of old blood, and they did not have iron clasps but leather ties that she loosened with hands that were not, she told herself, shaking. They were not shaking. She found what she was looking for in the 7th bundle. A list of Elder Council proceedings, the 4th moon of the 12th year, an emergency session, called without the standard 30-day notice, an exception that the records noted was permitted in cases of, and here came the language that made her stop breathing for a full 3 seconds, threatened contamination of a recognized bond. She read the rest of the entry. She read it twice. Threatened contamination. A request made by. The name was there, written in the cramped and slightly sideways hand she recognized as Elder Marin's. A request made by the High Council acting in concert. The bond recognition had been flagged as irregular. The recognized party had been assessed as ineligible by bloodstanding. The King's Council had invoked an ancient provision, used in the centuries before written records, a provision so old it didn't even have a name in the current statutes, only a reference number and a date from 300 years prior. The provision allowed for the dissolution of a bond recognition before it was formally sealed. The provision also, and here she had to read it 4 times, once for each direction her mind tried to run, allowed for the administration of a pack magic working. A specific working, one she had never heard of and could not quite believe was real. Severance of the recognized thread from the secondary party's memory, leaving the primary bond sense intact in the king, but ensuring the secondary party cannot find or feel or follow the thread that would lead her back to claim what the bond has promised her. She could feel the elder record in her hands, could feel the slightly rough texture of the pages against her fingertips, could feel the cold of the floor through her thin-soled working shoes. The secondary party. They had not named the secondary party. Not here, not in this record. Just as they had scratched the name from the bonding volume. They had excised her from every official record, and then they had reached inside her mind and excised her from her own. Her crooked 4th finger pressed against the page hard enough to bend it. She thought, "There is a room I cannot find the door to," she thought. Someone built the wall from the inside. Here is what was true on the other side of the palace, in the wing that faced north and west, where the wind came hardest off the mountain. Ragnar Ironhold was not sleeping. He rarely slept well, and he had stopped being embarrassed about this, which was one of the few genuine freedoms that came with being a king. He sat at the window of his private study, and he looked out at the dark, and he turned a small object over and over in his left hand, a piece of iron no longer than his thumb, bent into a rough circle, the kind of makeshift ring a young soldier might fashion in the field from whatever was close at hand. He had found it in his own pocket 7 years ago and had never been able to explain it. He remembered almost nothing of the 4th moon of his 12th year. He remembered before, and he remembered after, and in between was something that felt like a word on the tip of his tongue, present, insistent, refusing to resolve. He had a name for this, the ache, not a metaphor, an actual sensation low in the chest, like a door standing open in winter, a continuous and sourceless cold. His advisors had, over the years, offered various explanations. Bond sickness, they said, the unfortunate condition of an alpha king whose recognized mate had not survived to be found. It was tragic, they said, and they arranged their faces in the appropriate shapes when they said it, and he had watched them and said nothing, and kept the piece of iron in his pocket, and kept not sleeping. He did not believe his recognized mate was dead. He did not know why he didn't believe it. He had no evidence. He had nothing. He had a bent piece of iron and an ache and 7 years of careful, quiet searching through every record he could access without the council's knowledge. Because the council, he had understood for years, knew more about this than they were telling him. He just could not prove it. The piece of iron was cold in his hand. He turned it over. Outside, the wind came off the mountain with the smell of coming snow, iron and pine and something else. Something he kept almost catching and never catching, like a scent that didn't quite belong to the season. He closed his hand around the ring. He went to bed. He did not sleep. Isolde spent a week doing nothing. This was not nothing. This was the most deliberate nothing she had ever performed. She went to the archive. She catalogued. She attended the midweek scribes' meeting. She sat across from Vorn in their shared workspace and she watched him from the corner of her wandering left eye. And she noted, with precise and patient attention, every time he said something that landed slightly off-true. There were 3 such moments in the first week, 4 in the second. He was not a sophisticated liar. He was a careful one, which was different, and perhaps more dangerous. Careful liars had time and practice on their side, and they had long since learned which questions not to answer by the simple method of declining to hear them. But Vorn had a tell. When he was concealing something, his left hand, which was missing the tip of the middle finger, lost to a childhood accident with a wood-splitting axe, he had said once casually, in a way that invited no further questions. His left hand settled very slightly behind his opposite wrist, as though putting itself out of sight. She watched for it. She learned its rhythm. She also, in the spaces between everything, pushed at the room she couldn't find. The one with the closed door, the winter impressions, the cold and iron and pine smell, and the heartbeat that was hers, and also somehow answering something. She pushed and she got nothing, and then she pushed again and she got slightly less than nothing. Something that felt like an absence that was shaped, like a space that had been occupied and carefully emptied, like a shelf someone had removed a book from and then, finding the gap too obvious, shifted the remaining books to cover it. The shifted books were wrong. That was the thing. When you knew what a full shelf looked like, you could see where the weight distribution had changed. She knew what full looked like. She just didn't know with what. The quarterly bonding ceremony was in 3 weeks. This was standard palace business. The bonding ceremony happened 4 times a year at the seasonal tides, when recognized pairs from across the territories came to have their bonds formally recorded and sealed in the presence of the Elder Council. It was the largest gathering of senior council members outside the Great Feast, and it was also, Isolde now understood, the event most likely to produce the kind of access she needed. Because the Elder Council, for the ceremony, used the private records room. And the private records room was adjacent to the chamber, where the ceremonial documents were prepared. And she was the junior archivist responsible for preparing those documents. She had 3 weeks. She used them. The first time she saw Ragnar Ironhold in person, not his portrait, not the official seals bearing his profile, not the distant figure at public occasions, was 2 days before the ceremony, when she was crossing the inner courtyard with a stack of document cases, and he was walking in the opposite direction with no guard she could see, which was apparently simply a thing he did that drove his household into quiet collective despair. He was taller than his portrait suggested. That was the first thing she registered, which was a useless thing to register. The second thing was that he moved like he was listening. Not in an anxious way, in the way of something that had been alert for a very long time, and had found a way to make it look like stillness. He had a scar that ran from just below his left cheekbone to the corner of his jaw, silver white against tanned skin, old enough to have been with him for years. His advisors probably hated that scar. It made him look like exactly what he was. He looked at her. She looked at him. Normal. This was normal. Courtiers and staff crossed the king's path all the time. She held the document cases against her chest, and she inclined her head and she kept walking, because that was the correct thing to do. She was 5 steps past him when she felt it. Not a sound. Not a touch. Something that had no sensory category she could name. A pull, like current in water, like the air before lightning, like a word spoken in a frequency just below hearing. It arrived in her chest, and she stopped walking because her body stopped first, without consulting her, and she stood in the middle of the courtyard with her document cases, and her heart doing something new and alarming against her ribs. She did not turn around. She made herself not turn around. She walked to the preparation chamber and set the documents down and stood with her back against a closed door and counted her own breaths until they evened out. And she thought, what was that? Ta, and she thought, I know what that was. T, and she thought, no you don't. T, and she thought, yes I do. Behind her, in the courtyard, and the viewer is going to know this before Isolde does, and that gap is going to ache for a while. So settle in. Ragnar had stopped walking. He stood in the center of the courtyard for a long moment. Then he turned and looked at the door that had closed behind a woman he had never seen before in his life, dark hair braided back. A crooked finger on her left hand, visible where she gripped the document cases. A left eye that didn't quite track with the right when she wasn't focused on a specific point. He put his hand in his pocket. The bent iron ring was so cold it burned. He stood there. Then one of his guard, appearing from the passage to his right because they had absolutely been there the entire time, and simply stayed out of his way when he was being deliberately informal, said quietly, My lord, the archivist, he said. His voice came out slightly rougher than usual. Junior archivist, my lord. Isolde. The guard consulted nothing. The name was simply known, Isolde of Ashmore. 3 years in the palace. Clean record. No affiliations. He said nothing. My lord? Nothing, he said. Thank you. He kept walking. His hand stayed in his pocket. She found him in the archive 2 days later. She had not planned for this. She had a great many plans, and none of them involved him being in the archive at the 7th hour of the morning, which was when she arrived, which meant he had gotten there before her and was standing at volume 7's shelf with his back to the door when she pushed it open. She stopped. He turned. He moved like someone who had heard her coming long before the door opened, which was, she reminded herself, simply what it meant to be a shifter of his bloodline. He could probably hear her 3 corridors away. She found this, in this particular moment, extremely inconvenient. You're the one who pulled the 12th year records, he said, not a question. She could have deflected. She was good at deflection. It was a professional skill, the archivist's version of a locked cabinet. But she looked at him standing in her archive in the early morning cold, and the pull from the courtyard was back, quieter now but no less present, and she thought about the room with the door she couldn't find, and she made a different choice. Someone scratched out a name, she said, in the bonding records for your 12th year. A pause. She could not read his expression. It was not blank. It was held, which was different. I know, he said. The floor did its strange shift again. You know, she said, I've known for years. I can't access those records without the council knowing. You can. He stopped. Then, you're the one who pulled the elder proceedings. Also yes. He looked at her for a long moment. The scar along his jaw caught the yellow archive light. And, he said, pack magic. She held herself very still, a specific working. Dissolution of the recognized bond sense in the secondary party. She paused. Do you know what you're supposed to feel when a bond is recognized? His jaw moved, just barely. Yes. Do you feel it? I've felt it for 7 years, he said, without a source. She swallowed. The secondary party. She stopped. Tried again. There's a thread. In the magic. The secondary party isn't supposed to be able to follow it back. That's what they said. They said, the elder records. 4th moon. 12th year. Emergency council session. She forced her voice to stay level. The provision they invoked also blocked memory, removed it. The secondary party would wake up not knowing. She stopped again. Her voice had done something she hadn't asked it to. Not knowing there had been anything to lose. The silence was long. Were you in the capital? He said finally, quietly. 7 years ago. She pressed her crooked finger against her palm. Hard, grounding. I don't remember, she said. That's the problem. There is a period of time I cannot remember, and there is a name scratched out of your records. And I pulled the elder proceedings, and neither of those records names the secondary party anywhere. And I? She stopped. He was watching her face. Not invasively, carefully. The way she watched a damaged record, looking for what was still legible. I don't know, she said. I don't have proof. She looked down at her hands, the crooked finger. The ink stain she'd had on her right index finger for so long she'd stopped seeing it. I have a gap, and you have an absence, and someone worked very hard to make sure neither of us could close it. The words were out before she'd decided to say them. He said nothing for 3 seconds. Who signed the elder proceedings? He said. Marin. She paused, acting in concert with the full council. Marin is dead, I know, but the others. He stopped himself. Something happened in his expression that she couldn't fully see because he turned slightly toward the shelf. Volume 7 sat there. He didn't touch it. The ceremony is in 2 days, he said. Yes, he looked back at her. The full council will be present. Yes. Something passed between them in the cold of the archive that she could not name. Not the pull. Not exactly. Something more deliberate than the pull. More mutual. Be careful, he said, with the document cases. In the preparation chamber, he looked at her steadily. Errors in ceremony documentation can have significant effects. She held his gaze. I'm very careful with documentation, she said. He left. She stood in the archive for a long time after, pressing her crooked finger into her palm, and the room she couldn't find the door to pressed back like it knew something was coming. Elder Solvith was 70 years old and had served on the High Council for 32 of them, and the one unique thing you'd notice about him, if you stood close enough, was that his right ear was slightly higher than his left. Not obviously, not grotesquely. Just enough that his expressions never quite looked symmetrical. And his displeasure, when he felt it, landed on one side of his face before the other. He was one of 6 surviving members of the council that had convened for the emergency session of the 12th year. He was also the one most comfortable handling the ceremony documents, which was why, of the 6, he was the one most likely to notice if something in those documents was imprecise. Isolde knew all of this. She had spent the better part of 2 weeks learning all of this. She also knew that the ceremonial document cases were arranged on the preparation chamber shelves in a specific order, and that the cases for the private records room were stored in the same chamber, and that the private records room contained, among other things, the full elder archive that the public records room did not. She was not planning theft. She was planning something more specific, more archival. She was planning to make something readable that had been made unreadable. There are certain things about pack magic that scribes who specialize in archival history know that most people don't. Because most people don't read primary sources from 3 centuries back, and the primary sources from 3 centuries back were written by scholars whose commitment to comprehensive record-keeping sometimes exceeded their discretion about what should be permanently committed to vellum. Isolde knew that pack memory workings left a trace. Not a visible trace, not under normal light, not to normal eyes, but a working of that magnitude, sustained over 7 years, would have embedded itself in the original record at the point of the severance. The scratched-out name was not just physically damaged. It had been worked. And worked things, if you knew the right technique, if you had a preparation solution of oak gall and iron sulfate in a ratio she had found specified in a footnote to a document from the archives of the 6th century, worked things could be made to reveal themselves. It was not her blood that would activate it. She had thought about this for a long time. She had read the secondary sources 3 times. She had sat with what she knew and what she suspected, and she had come to a conclusion she could not share with anyone, and which she was not at all certain about, and which she was going to act on anyway, because the alternative was putting Volume 7 back on the shelf and going back to her desk, and never looking at the gap again, and she found she couldn't do that. She found she had never been able to do that. It was his. The working had been anchored to the king's recognized bond sense. His blood had been used 7 years ago to seal it. Not with his knowledge, not with his consent. She was almost certain, taken somehow. The way councils take things from kings without asking permission when they believe they know better. His blood had made the wall. His blood, applied to the place where the name had been, would bring it down. She couldn't ask him for that directly. She didn't know if she trusted herself to ask him for that directly. What she could do was put the document, Volume 7, removed with careful bureaucratic justification and replaced with an equally careful placeholder, into the preparation chamber before the ceremony, along with the other documents the council would be handling, and wait to see what happened when a king touched his own bonding records in the presence of pack magic 7 years old. It wasn't a good plan. She knew it wasn't a good plan. It was the only one she had. The night before the ceremony, she did not sleep. She sat at the small desk in her quarters with a candle and her personal journal, not the official one, the actual one, which she kept in cipher out of the habit of someone who dealt daily with official records and knew perfectly well how easily they were accessed. And she wrote out everything she knew in careful, sequenced order. She had not been here for the 4th moon of the 12th year. She had no memory of it. She had felt something in the courtyard 2 days ago that had no rational explanation. She had found a gap in a record, and a gap in her own history, and both gaps were the same shape. She did not write, "I think I was his." She didn't write it because writing it would make it too solid and too terrifying, and also because she didn't know what she meant by it. She knew what the bonding records described. She had cataloged those records herself. She knew that recognized mates described the bond as a click of a key in a lock, as the first breath after a long underwater swim, as the end of a sentence you hadn't known was incomplete. She had no memory of any of that. She had an absence shaped exactly like it. She blew out the candle, sat in the dark, pressed her crooked finger against the desk surface until she could feel the grain of the wood. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow the document would be there. Either it would work or it wouldn't. Either the magic would hold or it would give. And if it gave, she would know. And then she would have to figure out what to do with knowing. She sat in the dark for a long time, and the room she couldn't find the door to pressed at the back of her consciousness, and for a moment, just a moment, she almost heard something through the wall. A word, maybe. Her own name. The ceremony was at the 3rd hour of the afternoon, when the autumn light came in through the great hall's upper windows at its clearest angle, stippling the flagstone floor gold and gray in alternating bands. 22 bonded pairs had traveled to Ironhold for the seasonal sealing. They were arranged on both sides of the central aisle, some of them nervous, some of them steady, one young couple near the back, barely managing not to hold hands openly, which was technically not done before the formal recognition. They kept doing it anyway and then catching themselves, which was genuinely and quietly lovely. Isolde stood to the side of the preparation alcove with the document cases, which was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had the eye of someone doing exactly her job. She had spent 3 years making sure this was what she looked like when she was doing exactly her job. Volume 7 was in the 3rd case. She had prepared it that morning. Oak gall and iron sulfate, the footnoted ratio, brushed so finely across the damaged entry that it was invisible to anything but the specific reaction she was hoping for. She watched the elder council take their places. She watched Solvith arrange his ceremonial documents with the care of someone who had done this 32 years, and found it sufficiently important to still treat with attention. His asymmetric face was composed and professional. He was good at his work. That was the problem with Solvith. He was genuinely good at his work, and his work, for decades, had included being absolutely certain that what he knew as pack law and pack custom was upheld without exception. And he had made a decision 7 years ago that he believed was correct, and probably, in some part of himself he'd never examined directly, still believed it. That was the second most frightening thing she'd learned about him. The most frightening was how calm he'd been in the elder records, how procedural. The emergency session notes weren't frantic or defensive. They were neat, orderly. The language of people who were absolutely certain they were right. Ragnar entered at the 3rd hour precisely. He was in formal court dress, a deep charcoal wool with iron fittings at his shoulder, and he moved through the hall with the easy authority of someone who had been doing this for decades and had long since stopped performing it. The scar on his jaw caught the afternoon light. He took his place at the head of the ceremony dais, and the hall went very quiet in the specific way that halls went quiet around Ragnar Ironhold, not from fear but from attention, the kind of quiet that meant something real is in the room. He did not look at her. She had not expected him to. She understood the plan. The understanding had been wordless in the archive, but it had been there. The ceremony began. She moved to the council table with the document cases at the appropriate moment, which was between the 8th and 9th pair. It was the correct moment for the archivist to bring the secondary documentation. Supporting records, historical precedent, the background files that the council sometimes referenced during complex bond verifications. It was so routine that Solvith barely glanced at her as she set the cases down. Volume 7 was in the 3rd case. She set it on the table. She returned to her position at the side of the alcove. She stood with her hands clasped and her face arranged in the expression of professional attention that she had been perfecting for 3 years. She waited. The ceremony continued. 10th pair, 11th pair. The young couple near the back moved forward, and their nervousness had resolved into something that looked like joy with the edges still shaky, and the elder presiding over their ceiling said the words, and they gripped each other's hands, and the hall registered it with a warm collective sound. 12th pair. A complication. The 12th pair had a record discrepancy. A minor thing. A naming error in the filed documentation. Solvith reached for the 3rd case without looking. He opened it. He removed Volume 7 the same way he had removed documents from council cases for 32 years, with the brisk confidence of someone who knows exactly what they're handling. He opened it to the 12th year, and Ragnar, at the head of the dais, 15 feet away, turned his head, not because he'd heard or seen anything specific. Because the king was a shifter of the oldest bloodline, and his bond sense, 7 years suppressed and still sourceless and still searching, recognized something. She would understand later that it was the smell. The oak gall preparation had a faint acidity, and the iron sulfate had that mineral note she had never been able to identify in the bonding records, and which she now understood was the smell of pack magic. Very old, activating. She would understand later. In the moment, she only saw him turn and she felt the pull. Not a suggestion, not a faint current. A pull, a tide. Something that had been held in a fist for 7 years and was now opening. Her hand came up. The crooked 4th finger. She pressed it against her chest, and something behind her sternum answered with a heat she didn't have words for, and the room she couldn't find the door to went. White. Not painful. Not frightening, like a door finding its key from the outside. The memories came back in sequence, not in a flood. This is important. This is the thing that she would describe later to anyone who asked, with great precision, because Isolde was a woman who believed in precision even when, especially when, precision was the only grip available on an experience that wanted to knock you down. They came back in sequence. like pages turning. She was 19. She was in the capital for the first time. She had a letter of introduction from her father's academic contacts. A letter that had gained her entry to the outer palace scribes' gallery, where public records were sometimes opened for scholarly consultation. She had come to see the first-century treaty documents. She had not come to see anything else. She had been in the gallery for 3 hours when someone came in who wasn't a scholar. He was 24 years old. He was not in court dress. He had come from the training grounds. She could see that, his hair damp and his eyes sharp and alive with recent exertion. He had not yet grown into the weight of what he was. He was still. She turned this over now, recovering it, getting the memory back in her hands. He was still at the stage where he moved like someone who was not yet quite used to every room going quiet around him. The scar was newer, redder, still becoming the silver line she knew now. He came to use the records, the same records she was using. He sat at the table 2 seats away and he reached past her for the index and his hand was close, just close, an inch from her wrist, and she had looked up and he had looked up and the click had happened. She had not known what it was. She was 19, and from a village, and her mother made candles and her father taught small children to read. She had no framework for what happened between one breath and the next at a records table in the scribes' gallery of the Ironhold Palace. She remembered the smell of him, pine resin and iron and something warm underneath, like banked coals. She remembered the way he had looked at her like she'd said something he was still processing. She remembered they had talked for an hour about the treaty documents and she had not thought it odd. She had thought it perfectly natural. She had thought, of course this was happening. Of course it had always been going to happen, which was, she now understood, the bond's hand in it. But it had also simply been true, which was the thing about bonds that the official records never quite captured. The bond does not invent feeling, it finds it. She remembered the 3 months that followed. She remembered that he had sent for her, formally, through channels that were careful enough to protect her from the court's attention. She remembered that she had come back 4 times before the council had noticed. She remembered the night he had pressed a piece of bent iron into her hand, a ring he'd made from a training nail because he'd had nothing else and hadn't wanted to wait for jewelers, and said, "I want to make this formal. I want you in the record. I want your name next to mine." She remembered that she had said yes. She remembered the morning she had woken up 3 days ride away in her parents' house in Ashmore with no memory of how she'd gotten there, and nothing, where the preceding 3 months should have been. She pressed her crooked finger against her chest, and the memories locked back into place like bones into a joint, aching and right. And in the great hall of Ironhold Palace, the document in Solvith's hands began to change. She would describe it later as a blossoming. She'd tried other words and they were all wrong, not dramatic enough or too dramatic, too soft or too violent. A blossoming was what it looked like. The scratched-out entry, the 3 lines of roughed vellum, darkening and then resolving. Letters forming in the damaged surface as the oak gall reacted with the magic woven into the original working. Not her hand, not his, yet. The working's own anchor, responding to the charge in the room. Solvith looked down at the page. His asymmetric face went, for the first time in Isolde's professional observation of it, completely and bilaterally still. "What?" said Solvith, quietly, in the tone of someone who has been very certain about something for a very long time and has felt that certainty move. Ragnar was already coming off the dais. The hall had not quite caught up yet. 22 bonded pairs and a full assembly of court were still in the process of realizing that something had shifted. The way you realize an earthquake only a half-second after the ground has already moved. The elder presiding over the ceremony had stopped mid-word. The young couple near the back had gone completely still with their hands still intertwined. Ragnar crossed the hall in 8 steps. His face was, She was watching his face. She couldn't not. His face was the face of a man at the end of a very long walk who has just seen the destination, and is not sure yet if he is allowed to be relieved. He reached the council table. He reached past Solvith, who did not move away, who had the complicated paralysis of a man whose certainty has cracked and not yet resolved into what comes after, and he picked up volume 7. He looked at the page. The entry was legible now. Fully legible, the letters dark and settled into the damaged vellum, as though they had always been there, as though the scratching had never happened, the way a scar sometimes disappears entirely in the right light, revealing the skin beneath as simply skin. In the matter of the bonding recognition made in the 4th moon of the 12th year, the king having come before the elder council and declared the bond sensed, the name of the recognized is Isolde of Ashmore, 20 years. He had made a clerical error in the original filing. He had given her age as 20. She had been 19. She had corrected it to 20 years because in the formal record it sounded more appropriate, and she had been 19 and uncertain, and had thought it might matter, and it had not mattered at all. And she had forgotten she'd changed it until this exact moment. He was looking at her. She was looking at him. The hall was completely silent. Isolde, he said, not a question. Her name in his voice, for the first time in 7 years, in her hearing, for the first time ever, in the restored version of herself that was only now assembling. And it landed in her chest like the last note of a piece of music she had been hearing fragments of for years. She said nothing. There were no words currently available to her. He set the volume down. He reached into his pocket and he produced a piece of iron no longer than his thumb, bent into a rough circle, and he held it out flat on his palm. And she looked at it and understood that she was looking at the thing she had given back, in the night they had erased, in the version of herself that no longer had a memory. She had given it back. He had kept it. Her hand came up without her deciding to move it. Her crooked 4th finger closed around the iron ring. The hall went electric, not violent, like a sound system resolving static into signal, a collective body sense of something completing that had been incomplete. And then Solvith said, "This changes nothing." Of all the things he might have said, this was the one that went wrong in the room most immediately. It was not, strictly speaking, the worst possible thing to say. Solvith was a procedural man, and a procedural man, when confronted with the unexpected collapse of something he had built, reaches for procedure. What he meant was, the provision we invoked was legal. The grounds remain. What he meant was, blood standing is blood standing. What he meant, underneath both of those, was the thing he had always meant and never quite said, which was that the High King of the Northern Pax could not, should not, had no business binding himself to a village schoolteacher's daughter from Ashmore with no pack affiliation and no bloodline, and nothing, by his measure, to offer. What landed in the hall, however, was different. What landed was, she can be erased again. Ragnar turned. He was, by nature and long practice, not a man who raised his voice. He commanded rooms through the specific quality of his attention, the way very large, very capable things command rooms, simply by being oriented in your direction. This was true now. He turned toward Solvith, and he gave him the full weight of his attention, and the room temperature dropped, not metaphorically. The provision, he said, required my blood. Solvith's asymmetric face arranged itself. The provision allows for my blood, flat, without my knowledge, without my consent. You took it while I was sleeping, the night after I filed the recognition. A silence. That's a serious charge, said another council member, Aldrich. Isolde had catalogued him, 58, a large man with a red-gray beard, and the single distinguishing feature of a thumb on his right hand that bent permanently backwards from an old injury, the kind of perpetual oddity that drew the eye without the owner ever noticing. He looked uncomfortable in the way that people look uncomfortable when they know the truth and have decided to manage rather than acknowledge it. It's a fact, said Ragnar. I know it because the record you made of it is in the Elder Archive and Isolde of Ashmore has read it, and she will, if asked, read it aloud to this court right now. All eyes to Isolde. She had not been planning to speak yet. She had been planning to. She wasn't sure what she'd been planning. The plan had not quite extended past the moment of the blossoming. She looked at the court, at the 22 bonded pairs, who had come here in good faith for a seasonal ceremony and had gotten something considerably more significant, at the young couple near the back, who had stopped pretending not to hold hands and were now simply holding them openly, at Solvith, who was looking at her with the expression she had learned to recognize as management mode, at Ragnar, who was looking at her with an expression she could not fully catalog yet, because she had only just gotten back the memories that would give her context for it. She thought about the room with the door that was now open. She thought about 7 years of a gap shaped exactly like a person. She thought about her crooked finger and the bent iron ring and the ink stain on her right index finger, and the fact that she had cataloged 11 volumes of bonding records and knew their weight and smell and every sticking clasp, and had spent 3 years in this palace making herself useful and invisible and correct, and had spent 2 weeks mapping the lie that had been built inside the thing she loved most. And she thought, they built the wall inside me. I want them to know I felt it from the inside. Yes, she said. Her voice was level. She had been practicing level for a very long time. I'll read it. She read it. All of it. The emergency session notes, the provision invoked, the language around blood standing, and irregular recognition, and the phrase that was the worst one, the one that had been written in Elder Marin's neat, cramped hand, and which now belonged to everyone in the hall. The secondary party's removal is in the interest of pack stability and the appropriate elevation of the alpha line. She read it in the same voice she used for trade agreements and census records. She held the document the way she held all documents, carefully, as though its existence mattered. When she finished, the hall was silent for a long time. Then Ragnar said, without raising his voice, Solvith. Solvith stood very still, with his asymmetric face very still, and said nothing. You will step down from the council, said Ragnar, today, with the full public record of the reason. And Aldrich, he turned, you and every member of the council who participated in that session will present themselves to me privately this week, and we will have a conversation about what remains owed. A pause. To her, not to me. Aldrich's backwards bending thumb pressed against his opposite palm. My lord, that was a statement, said Ragnar, not a proposal. Solvith looked at Isolde. She had expected, maybe, defiance, or the continued certainty, or anger. What she got was something she hadn't prepared for, which was that Solvith, for just a moment, looked genuinely sorry. Not for what he'd done, she thought, but for what it had produced, the gulf between the outcome he'd intended and the outcome standing in front of him. It was a small and insufficient sorry. It was the only kind he had. She did not forgive him. She had not decided yet whether she ever would. But she saw him, which was different, and filed him accurately, which was what she was trained to do. He left, not immediately, not without the careful, composed movements of a man managing a retreat. But he left. The ceremony resumed. This was Ragnar's call, made quietly to the presiding elder while the council reshuffled, and it was the right call. The 22 pairs had come for a sealing, and they deserved it, and forcing them to disperse and reschedule over palace business that was not their fault would have been its own small injustice. Isolde respected this. She stood at the side of the preparation alcove, and she watched the remaining pairs come forward, and she held the bent iron ring in her left hand, the cold of it warming slowly against her palm. She felt the court's attention returning to her periodically. She was used to being seen as peripheral. This was new. She was not sure yet what to do with new. He came to her when the last pair had been sealed, and the hall was dispersing, Not immediately, not urgently. He crossed to her at the pace of someone who had been waiting a very long time and had learned the discipline of not running. "You could have told me," he said, quietly. "Told you what?" "That you suspected, earlier. In the archive." He stopped a few feet away. Not close enough to press, not far enough to be formal. Instead of, he gestured slightly at the hall, the general direction of everything that had just happened. She thought about this. She thought about standing in the archive in the cold yellow light and making calculations. "I needed the record to speak," she said. "Not me. Not a claim I made that could be managed and denied, the record." He was silent for a moment. "You didn't trust me," he said. Not accusatory, observing. "I didn't trust myself," she said honestly. "I didn't know what I remembered and what I had, constructed. I needed evidence. I'm an archivist." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. The particular expression of someone recognizing something they had missed. "You're an archivist," he said, like she'd said something that explained a great deal. "I'm also?" She stopped. She looked down at the ring in her hand. The bent iron, the training nail ring he had made because he hadn't wanted to wait for jewelers. "I think I'm also someone you made a promise to. 7 years ago, which I would like too. I don't want to be claimed," she said carefully. "I want to be asked." He looked at her for a long moment, then he said, "I remember every word of it. The treaty records the first hour and everything after." A pause. "I would like to ask, then ask," she said. He did. She said yes. This requires perhaps a single breath of clarification, not because the yes was complicated, but because it was not simple, in the way a fairy tale yes is simple. She said yes with all 7 of the recovered years sitting inside her. With the knowledge of what yes cost the first time, with a wariness that was not going to dissolve in a ceremony hall, or probably in a season or possibly in a year. She said yes with her crooked finger and her ink stain and her absolutely functional personal archive of everything that had been done to her without her consent, and she said it. Because she had the memories back now, and she knew what she'd felt at the records table when he'd reached past her for the index, and his hand had been an inch from her wrist. And she knew the difference between a bond that found feeling and one that invented it, and she knew which one this was. She said yes, and the ache under it was real, and the warmth under that was realer. He took her hand, the one with the crooked finger. He held it carefully, like he knew where the old break was, though she hadn't told him, which meant he had simply learned the geography of her hand sometime in the 3 months they had spent together that she had only just gotten back. The hall was mostly empty by then. Just the ceremony staff and the presiding elder, who had the good professional sense to suddenly become very absorbed in tidying the ceremony documents. "Your records will need to be updated," she said. He looked at her. Yes, all of them. She held his gaze. "Every volume, everything that was." She paused. "I'd like to do it myself. I'm the most qualified." "You're the most qualified," he agreed. And this time it was close to a smile. She looked down at their joined hands, her crooked finger. His ring, back where it had started, back in her keeping. "I need you to know," she said, "that I am not. I'm not the same person who left, the one in the records. I've been someone else for 7 years, and I don't know yet how much of that I'm keeping." "I know," he said. "I don't want to be written over," she said. "Not even by the true version. I want to be." She stopped. "Accurately recorded," he said. She looked up. "Accurately recorded," she said. "Yes." Volume 7 was sent to the Restoration Archive the following week. This is what that means, in practice. The damaged entry was not repaired in the way a cracked surface is smoothed over. It was left visible. The scratch marks, the roughed vellum, the evidence of what had been done. All of it was preserved and documented with a full notation appended in Isolde's own hand, in the precise ink-stained script that was recorded in the palace register as the hand of the senior palace archivist, a position that was confirmed effective the 2nd week of the new month after a process that Vaughan navigated with the asymmetric dignity of a man who had been outmaneuvered on the merits and knew it. She wrote the notation in 2 drafts and then a clean copy. The notation described the tampering, the provision invoked, the working performed. It named the council members who had voted for the emergency session. It named the provision. It named every piece of the machinery that had been used to build the wall, and it named them clearly, in the archival tradition, of leaving a record that could not be argued with. And then she wrote, in the damaged entry itself, in the space that the magic had opened and the oak gall had revealed, this entry was subject to deliberate alteration by council names and date, all present and correct. The original text naming Isolde of Ashmore as the recognized mate of Ragnar Ironhold, High King, has been restored by examination of the working used to damage it. So the restoration was performed by Isolde of Ashmore in the 17th year of the king's reign. Below that, in a different hand, not by her, she had not asked for this, he had done it without announcing it. She had opened the volume to add the restoration date and found it already there, in his handwriting, which she recognized from the formal documents she had spent 3 years cataloging. The name above is accurate. I have signed it, and his seal. She stood in the archive with the volume in her hands, her crooked finger pressed flat against the page, and she read his 2 sentences 3 times. The archive was cold. The heating stones had not been replaced yet. She did not mind. There are things that don't come back cleanly after a memory working of that magnitude, and she knew this going in because she had read everything she could find about it. Which was not very much, because the relevant scholarship was limited, and the first-hand accounts more limited still. There are impressions that return altered. There are moments you remember feeling but can no longer remember why. There are days in the recovered 3 months that remain blurry at the edges, not because the magic held, but because memory is not a document. It is a living thing, and living things sustain damage differently than vellum. She had a very clear and very precise memory of the records table, the index, the inch of space. She had a clear memory of the iron ring. She had a clear memory of the last morning, waking up in Ashmore with nothing. The precise and specific nothing. The way you can remember the shape of what's missing, even when you cannot remember the missing thing. What she had less clearly were the middle months, the conversations. The accumulation of ordinary hours that she trusted had been good, that the bone sense of the recovered feeling confirmed had been real, but which she was essentially taking on evidence rather than direct recollection. She said this to him one evening in the early weeks, in the archive, where they had somehow developed a habit of ending the day before she went to her quarters and he went to his. A liminal hour, unofficial, unannounced, the 2 of them sharing the yellow light and the smell of old vellum, and occasionally a silence that had stopped being uncomfortable. "There are months I don't fully have back," she said. He was looking at a primary source from the 1st century she'd pulled for him to see the original treaty language. He set it down. "I know," he said. "Does that?" She stopped. "No," he said. He knew what she'd been going to ask. "You can't know." "I know what was in those months," he said. "And you're still you. The part of you the way you cataloged the damage before you trusted the feeling. The way you made the record speak instead of asking me to believe you." He paused. "You were exactly that at 19. The months wouldn't change it." She thought about this for a long time. "I made the record speak," she said, "because I was also afraid you wouldn't." He looked at her. "Believe me," she said. A long silence. He had done one thing in the week since the ceremony that had sat in her like a small stone. He had moved very quickly the day after to confirm the council changes, to make the public record of Solvith's removal, to put his seal to the notation in Volume 7. He had moved so quickly and so decisively that she had more than wondered, whether some part of the speed was guilt moving his action. the impulse of a king who had failed to protect what he'd recognized and was compensating in the only vocabulary available to him, which was authority. She had not said this until now. "Yes," he said. She waited. "That's true," he said. "I should have been looking harder. For 7 years." He looked at the primary source in front of him, not seeing it. "I knew the council had done something. I had enough to suspect. Not enough to prove. And I—" He stopped, turned the page without reading it. "I waited for proof instead of moving before I had it. And you were somewhere without your memory for 7 years because I waited." She let this sit. She did not tell him it was all right. It wasn't, quite. She did not tell him she forgave him, because she had been in the business of accurate records long enough to know that premature forgiveness was just a more comfortable form of denial. "I know," she said. "I know you know." He looked at her. "And? And you're going to have to live with that," she said. "And so am I. And the question is what we do with what comes after the knowing." He was quiet. Then, "What do we do?" She thought of the notation she'd written, the restoration she'd made visible, the damage documented alongside the document. "We keep accurate records," she said. The formal bonding ceremony was in the spring, at the first moontide. She wore her work dress. This was a choice, discussed with no one but made deliberately. Not defiance, exactly, but precision. The work dress was dark blue wool, good quality, with the ink stain on the right sleeve that had been there so long. It was simply part of it. She was an archivist. She had gotten there by examination, first among 47. She was not going to become a different person for the ceiling. Ragnar, when he saw her, said nothing. He looked at the ink stain and then at her face, and she saw the corner of his mouth move. "I know," she said. "I'm a disgrace." "You're exact," he said. The elder presiding was not Solveth. Solveth had been replaced by a woman named Era, 45, with a single long gray braid that fell over her left shoulder, and a reputation for straightforward procedure. She had read the annotated Volume 7 3 times before accepting the appointment. She had said, when asked for her response to the full account of what the previous council had done, only, "We'll need to review every emergency provision invoked in the last 50 years. Isolde respected this. She had said so. The ceremony was small. Court was present. It was the Alpha King's formal bonding. Court was always present. But she had requested, and been granted, a ceremony without elaboration. The words, the record, the seal. The elder spoke the words. They were old words, older than the written records that Isolde knew, old enough that the language had a slightly different rhythm than modern speech. More formal in some places, and more direct in others. There was a line in the middle of the old form that had always struck her, when she'd read it in the bonding volumes, as the most honest thing in the whole ceremony. What has been found is not new. What has been found was always there. The record now names only what was already true. She had read those words 100 times. Catalog work, archival routine. She had not understood until now why they made her chest do what it was doing. She did not cry. She had made a decision about this in advance, and she held to it, not because crying would have been wrong, but because she wanted to be fully present for every word, and she trusted herself to fall apart later, in private, when she had time to do it properly. Ragnar's hand was around hers, the bent iron ring on her finger now properly fitted. He had taken it to a jeweler, quietly, without announcement, and had it resized, and had returned it to her on a Tuesday morning in the archive with no ceremony whatsoever, which had somehow been more affecting than a ceremony would have been. The elder completed the words. She looked at Ragnar. He looked at her. The court witnessed. Isolde of Ashmore, archivist, daughter of a schoolteacher and a woman who made candles and smelled of beeswax every day. First among 47, crooked fourth finger, ink stain, wandering left eye. 26 years old and in possession, finally, of the record of herself. She had found her name in the scratch marks. She had known it by its absence. She had built the proof from footnotes and oak gall and the mineral smell of old pack magic, and she had stood in a ceremony hall and read the truth aloud to the court that had buried it, and she had come through the other side of it carrying the gap, the cost, the 7 years and the months she would never get back, and the particular shape of an absence that had taught her more about herself than presence might have. She had not emerged from this clean. She carried it. She would carry it. She was choosing to carry it forward. Volume 7 lives in the restored section of the Ironhold archive, where it has its own case and its own notation and its own small card in the catalog that Isolde had typed herself. Volume 7, Bonding Records, Reign of Ragnar Ironhold, High King. 12th year entry restored following deliberate damage. Full documentation of alteration and restoration appended. This volume is a complete record. Not repaired, not cleaned up, complete. There is a newer volume now, Volume 12, Isolde's name in it twice. Once as archivist who certified the accuracy of the records, once as the person the king's bond recognized, in the formal language of the old words, in the 4th moon of the 12th year, and again in the 1st moon of the 17th. On the shelf, beside, it is a collection she began compiling in the 2nd year of her appointment as senior archivist, a review of every emergency provision invoked in the last 50 years, as Ira had suggested. She is 3/4 through it. What she has found is not, in the end, surprising. What she has found is what you always find when you commit to an accurate record of a thing that preferred to stay unexamined. That the damage was older and wider than the single wound you started with, and that the work of recording it honestly is longer than you planned, and that the record is worth more than your comfort with what it contains. She knows this. She was trained for this. She was always going to do this work. She had been doing it in her way, since she was a girl in a schoolteacher's house who believed that written down truth stayed true. She had simply, for a while, been doing it for other people's pasts. Now she is doing it for her own. There is a Thursday every week. She does not make a ceremony of it. She simply goes to the archive an hour before her official day begins, in the yellow light from the imperfectly cleaned windows, and she sits with whatever is in front of her, and she works. Sometimes Ragnar finds her there. He does not announce himself. He is, by nature and long practice, a man who is often in rooms before anyone expects him, which the palace has learned to accommodate, and his guard has learned to work around, and Isolde has simply come to accept as a feature, like the drafts in the Eastern Wing, something that is simply part of the architecture. He brings the heating stone replacement himself when the one near her bench goes dark, which it does with some frequency. She has told him once that she doesn't mind the cold, which is technically true, and he has continued bringing the replacement stone anyway. Which is not technically doing what she told him, but is accurate to what she meant. This is, she has found, most of it. Not the ceremony in the hall, not the formal record now in Volume 12, not even the words read aloud to the court that buried her and then had to hear it all read back. Most of it is the heating stone, the Tuesday morning with the ring, the corner of his mouth at the ink stain, the 2 sentences in his handwriting that she found when she opened the volume to add the restoration date and did not ask him about, that she simply left as part of the record. She had believed for a long time that the archive was the place where things could not be altered or forgotten or denied. She still believes this, with the amendment. The archive is not where things stay unchanged. The archive is where the truth of what happened, including the alteration, including the denial, can always be found again. What is erased is not the same as what is gone. She holds this in the yellow Thursday light, her name beside his, in the record that wrote it back.